Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging into a situation that, well, it might seem at first glance like a purely domestic issue for the United States.
Right. Something happening just within its borders.
Exactly. But it's one with immediate and, frankly, profound global repercussions. We're talking about the recent headlines coming out of Los Angeles.
Yeah, the protests there.
Protests against federal immigration operations that escalate, really escalate, to the point where the National Guard was called in.
It's a significant step, deploying the Guard domestically like that.
Absolutely. And imagine, if you will, the world's news feeds, from Beijing to Berlin, suddenly filled with images of burning rubber, massive marches right in downtown LA.
These images travel instantly now.
They do. And these aren't isolated incidents happening in a vacuum. They get woven into this much larger international narrative about American stability, American leadership, even questions about the very nature of democracy itself.
It feeds into existing perceptions or maybe challenges them.
For sure. So this moment in Los Angeles, you've got thousands of National Guard troops deployed, over 100 arrests, a really high-stakes legal battle playing out between the state and federal authorities. It offers us a unique lens.
A case study almost.
Kind of. And for you, our listener, understanding this isn't just about, catching up on the news cycle. It's about seeing how intricately domestic policy is connected to foreign perception.
How the internal affects the external.
Precisely. And what this specific moment tells us about the challenges faced by global powers generally in the 21st century. It's about peeling back the layers to understand the true impact of these internal pressures on external influence.
Okay, so where do we start? What was the spark?
Right, let's unpack this. The catalyst, the immediate trigger for these June 2025 protests in Los Angeles was this direct and pretty fiery opposition to immigration and customs enforcement operations, ICE. Specifically, actions described as federal immigration sweeps. So, targeted operations by federal agents going in to apprehend individuals suspected of immigration violation.
Okay, so focused enforcement actions.
Right. But the reaction wasn't just your typical organized demonstration. Reports painted a really vivid picture of escalating civil disorder. We're talking about smashing windows, looting stores, and tossing Molotov cocktails.
So it turned violent.
Yeah.
Significantly.
It seems so. This wasn't just dissent. It was described as significant, visible unrest, transforming parts of downtown LA into a truly volatile scene.
And those images, as you said, went global.
Exactly. For anyone watching, whether here in the U.S. or internationally, those images conveyed a sense of a city really on edge, struggling to maintain order.
Which naturally leads to the government response.
It does. The presidential response to this rapidly unfolding chaos was swift. Quite assertive, actually. President Trump initially authorized the mobilization of 2,000 National Guard troops.
Okay, 2,000.
But within hours, it seems, as the situation appeared to intensify, an additional 2,000 troops were called in. That brought the total deployment up to 4,000.
Wow, that's a rapid doubling. Shows how seriously they viewed it.
It certainly suggests that. Over 100 arrests were made pretty quickly, too, underscoring this determined federal response to what they clearly viewed as a significant breakdown of law and order.
And it wasn't just happening on the streets, was it? There was a legal dimension brewing almost immediately.
That's a crucial point. What was happening there?
Well, what's critical to understand here is that this wasn't just a confrontation, between protesters and authorities. It quickly morphed into a significant legal and jurisdictional clash. State versus federal.
Ah, the classic tension.
Exactly. California Governor Gavin Newsom, and he was backed initially by U.S. District Judge Charles Breyer, they took a pretty bold step. They tried to halt the deployment of the California National Guard.
So, the state trying to block the feds from using its guard?
Essentially, yes. Arguing against the president's direct control over state forces in this specific context. Their move highlighted that fundamental tension in our federal system. Where does state sovereignty end and federal executive power begin? It's a perennial question.
But it didn't stop the deployment.
No. An appeals court ultimately intervened, and they allowed President Trump to retain control over the deployed National Guard.
So the federal view prevailed in court.
In that instance, yes. And that ruling, it didn't just affect the streets of Los Angeles, it reaffirmed, at least in the short term, a pretty robust interpretation of federal executive power during a domestic crisis, even over the objections of a state's highest officials.
It's a powerful reminder then, isn't it? That while states have significant autonomy, the president retains considerable authority to deploy federalized forces when it's deemed necessary to enforce federal law or restore order.
Absolutely. It sets a precedent, or at least reinforces an existing one.
Okay, so we have the events, the federal response, the legal challenge. What about the public? How did Americans react to seeing troops on the streets of LA?
Right. Public opinion. Always key.
Well, let's consider how the American public reacted immediately to this troop deployment. RMG Research ran a poll, about 1,000 registered voters. And the results, well, they revealed a deeply divided nation, almost perfectly mirroring the political divide we see on so many other issues.
Not surprising, perhaps, but what were the numbers?
52% of respondents approved either strongly or somewhat of President Trump's decision to send in the National Guard.
Okay, just over half.
But on the flip side, 42% disapproved. And then you had a small slice, 7%, who were unsure.
So hardly a clear consensus, more like a nation split.
Exactly. It highlights a nation grappling with how to balance order, the right to protest, and this idea of federal intervention. What it tells us is there was no unified public mandate here, which always complicates how events like this are understood and framed.
And does this connect to broader views on immigration? Because that was the initial spark, right?
It seems to. If we connect these reactions to the broader sentiment around immigration, Rasmussen polling indicated a subtle but I think significant trend. There was a slight dip in the percentage of voters who felt the president's deportation efforts had gone too far. It moved from 40% down to 37%.
A small shift, but noticeable.
Yes. And this slight shift reinforces a really deeply ingrained national viewpoint. Rasmussen also pointed out that for decades, literally decades, something like 80% of voters have called illegal immigration bad for America.
That's a very consistent long-term view for a large majority.
It is. So while the protests in LA were this direct outcry against specific IC operations, you had a substantial portion of the public reflecting these long-held views on immigration, seemingly aligning with the idea of stronger enforcement, even if that meant federal troops on city streets.
So it's this complex interplay then. Public opinion isn't monolithic. It's a clash not just of actions on the ground, but of these deeply held beliefs about immigration, order, and federal power.
Absolutely. The narrative around these protests is far from straightforward.
And this brings us directly to the politics of it all. The political impact, especially when you have widespread unrest. There's that old saying, right?
Which one?
That widespread political unrest is rarely to the benefit of the incumbent party. In this case, with Republicans in power, sustained chaos in a major American city. That could be seen as a liability, a signal, perhaps, of a failure to maintain order.
Makes sense. Incumbents usually want stability.
Usually. But the public discourse, even just looking at platforms like Reddit, revealed a much more nuanced and, frankly, strategically minded debate playing out.
How so? What were people saying?
Well, some users articulated a very clear political calculation. The thinking went something like this. If the protests turn into looting, destruction of property, and violence, the left and therefore Democrats will lose.
Ah, the idea that the visuals of chaos hurt the side perceived to be aligned with the protesters.
Precisely. This viewpoint suggests that the visual chaos, regardless of the protesters' initial intent or message, could be leveraged politically, used to paint the opposition as irresponsible or even complicit in lawlessness, and thereby discredit their broader political agenda. It's a powerful narrative tool, especially in such a polarized environment.
And surely there was pushback on that view.
Oh, definitely. Other voices on those same platforms pushed back forcefully. They argued against any accusation of supporting the violence, saying things like, some opportunists took advantage of the chaos law enforcement and the military created.
So reframing the violence, not inherent to the protests, but a consequence of the response or just bad actors exploiting the situation.
Exactly. It's an attempt to shift the blame, to control the narrative, and crucially, to ensure the core message of the protest isn't completely ground out by those images of destruction.
The strategic battle over the narrative, it must filter down, right, to the average person watching the news.
Absolutely. It often filters down to what you might call the normie perspective. The average citizen who just wants to know, WTF is going on? Why is my shop on fire?
Right. They're not necessarily digging into the legal nuances or the history.
Not usually. For this segment of the population, the complexities, federal versus state authority, the specific demands of the protesters, they often get boiled down to a really stark, simplified divide.
Like what?
Well, in this case, as one observer noted online, it becomes a perception where Trump backs ICE and Democrats back protesters and rioters.
Wow, that's incredibly simplistic. Potent, I imagine.
Very potent. This simplified, visceral understanding can be incredibly powerful in shaping public opinion, often overshadowing all the intricate details of the situation. It's really a testament to how quickly complex events get reduced to partisan soundbites in our current political climate.
And that's just the domestic view. What happens when we turn the lens outward? How did the rest of the world see this?
Well, what becomes immediately fascinating when we pivot to the international stage is how quickly other nations, particularly those with their own geopolitical agendas, seized upon these domestic events in Los Angeles.
Like who?
China, for instance. Chinese state media and netizens, they openly mocked Los Angeles protests. There was one particularly biting comment going around suggesting that the TV show House of Cards played it too safe.
Ouch. Implying reality was more absurd than fiction.
Pretty much. Implying that the American political drama series, known for its, dramatic and often cynical portrayal of U.S. politics, couldn't even capture the perceived absurdity and instability of real-life events unfolding in the U.S.
Is this a new thing, this kind of commentary from China?
Not at all. This isn't just casual observation. It's a deliberate and pointed strategy. If we look at the bigger picture, this is a pattern we've seen before. Remember January 2021?
A Capitol storming.
Right. Following that, the state-run Global Times in China published this scathing editorial. The title was something like, "Capitol Mob Represents an Internal Collapse of U.S. Political System."
So they're consistent in this framing.
Very consistent. For them, the unrest in L.A. wasn't some isolated incident. It was another opportunity to publicly highlight what they characterize as perceived American instability and internal fragility, broadcasting it to a global audience. They leverage these domestic issues to bolster their own narratives about the perceived failures of the U.S. democratic system, often contrasting it favorably with their own model of governance. It's a clear case of using America's internal struggles as a foreign policy tool.
It also raises this important question, doesn't it, about how leaders in other nations choose to respond, or maybe are forced to respond, when American domestic issues spill across borders like this.
Definitely. It puts them in a tricky position sometimes.
Consider Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum. She publicly and quite unequivocally condemned violence, stating, "We condemn violence no matter where it comes from." Pretty standard diplomatic stuff, maybe.
Seems like it. But there was more context, right?
Yes. This statement came in direct response to accusations from the U.S. Secretary of Homeland Security, Kristi Noem. Noem had claimed Sheinbaum had somehow encouraged violence among the anti-immigration enforcement protesters in L.A.
Wow, that's a serious accusation to level against a head of state.
It is. And President Sheinbaum didn't mince words in her rebuttal. She directly refuted Noem's accusations, calling them misrepresentation and asserting that Noem was deliberately lying.
So a very public, very heated exchange.
Absolutely. This wasn't just a quiet diplomatic disagreement. It was right out there in the open. It vividly illustrates how even direct neighbors are forced to navigate and publicly respond to the political fallout of these U.S. domestic events, sometimes finding themselves dragged right into American internal political debates.
It really makes you realize how quickly a domestic protest can become an international incident, doesn't it?
It really does.
And that leads us to think about the underlying conflict, at least as it was framed by some of the protesters themselves. We saw these narratives emerging, particularly on platforms like Reddit again, under the banner of No Kings protests.
No kings. What does that signify?
It harks back to revolutionary ideals, I suppose. Participants were asserting a perceived right to resist federal actions if, as they saw it, federal agencies act like the Gestapo, disappearing people. Strong language.
Very strong. Comparing IC to the Gestapo.
Yes. The sentiment was that if ICE was operating in a manner perceived as overreaching or unlawful, then protesters felt justified in their resistance. They believed firmly that AC had no business there.
So it wasn't just about policy disagreement, but a fundamental challenge to the legitimacy of the federal action itself.
Exactly. This viewpoint underscores a deeply embedded belief among some protesters that ICE's presence and actions were not just unwelcome, but illegitimate, providing a kind of moral, perhaps even a constitutional justification for their resistance.
Rooted in fears of government overreach.
Precisely. Rooted in historical fears of government overreach and unchecked power. It's directly challenging the authority of federal agents on the ground. For these protesters, it wasn't just about immigration policy. It was about fundamental rights and the limits of state power, a classic American tension playing out in real time on the streets.
Which brings us back to the legal framework. How can the president deploy troops domestically? What are the rules?
Right, to truly understand the legal basis for the president's actions in Los Angeles, and really anytime federal troops are deployed domestically, we have to delve into the foundational laws. The primary piece of legislation here is the Posse Comitatus Act.
Posse Comitatus. Heard the name, but what does it actually do?
In its simplest form, it's codified as 18 U.S.C. Section 1385, and it generally prohibits the use of federal military forces for domestic law enforcement purposes.
So, keeping the military out of policing.
Essentially, yes. Think of it as a clear barrier designed to keep our military from acting like a police force on our own streets, preserving the civilian nature of law enforcement. This separation is a bedrock principle, meant to prevent the armed forces from being used to suppress civilian dissent or enforce civil laws, functions typically reserved for police.
But there must be exceptions, right? Given what happened.
There are, but they must be expressly authorized by the Constitution or Act of Congress. It's meant to be a high bar. It's also worth noting a specific detail. While it applies to the Army and the Air Force, the Act doesn't technically apply to the Navy and the Marine Corps.
That's an interesting wrinkle. So, different rules for different branches.
Technically, yes. It's a subtle but potentially significant distinction when you consider which federal forces might be brought to bear in a domestic crisis.
And where did this act even come from? What's its history?
The historical roots are incredibly telling. It reveals just how deeply this tension between federal power and states' rights is woven into American law. Posse Comitatus emerged from deep resentment among Southern states in the post-Civil War Reconstruction era.
Reconstruction. Always complicated.
Deeply. After the war, federal military intervention was used quite effectively to quash Klan violence and enforce Reconstruction policies, particularly those aimed at protecting the rights of newly freed slaves.
So the federal military was enforcing civil rights against local resistance.
Exactly. Southern states viewed this as an egregious overreach of federal power into their internal affairs. So the act, Posse Comitatus, was a direct pushback, an attempt to limit the federal government's ability to use its military to enforce laws within state borders, especially when those laws were unpopular with local authorities or interfered with established social orders. It's a principle born directly out of that power struggle, not just abstract legal theory.
Okay, so Posse Comitatus says no military for law enforcement generally, but then how does the president send in troops?
Right. There's a critical counterbalancing statute, the Insurrection Act. It's found in Title 10 of the U.S. Code, Sections 251 to 255. And this act grants the president broad authority to use federal troops domestically under specific, quite grave conditions. For instance, the president can invoke it when an obstruction, combination, or assemblage or rebellion against the United States authority hinders the execution of laws. Or, and this is crucial, when it deprives people of their constitutional rights and state authorities fail or refuse to protect them.
Like the civil rights examples?
Precisely. It also applies when there's a situation that opposes or obstructs the execution of the laws of the United States.
Those conditions sound quite broad, though. Obstructs the execution of laws.
They are intentionally broad, yes. It provides the president with significant leeway to act during times of serious internal unrest, particularly when state authorities are seen as overwhelmed, unwilling, or maybe even actively obstructing federal law. It's a powerful tool designed ultimately to preserve the Union and uphold the Constitution.
But does broad mean unlimited?
That's the key debate. Despite its broad language, legal reviews suggest that the Act's modern codification, which happened back in 1956, was not meant to be substantively expanded.
Meaning Congress didn't intend to give away the farm, so to speak.
Right. The implication is that even with that sweeping wording, the legislative intent wasn't to grant presidents unfettered power beyond its original scope. Legal scholars often argue that courts should reject textualist arguments that suggest Congress has covertly or inadvertently delegated broad, expansive authorities to the executive branch.
So interpret it within its historical context, not as a blank check.
Exactly. It's about maintaining that balance between presidential necessity in a crisis and the constitutional limits on power.
Let's look at some history then. How has this played out before? You mentioned civil rights.
Yes. When we look back at historical precedents, we can really see the nuances of these laws in action. A particularly powerful and tragic example is Bloody Sunday in Selma, Alabama, back in 1965.
The march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge.
That's the one. After Alabama state troopers brutally attacked those peaceful civil rights marchers, and the whole thing was broadcast live on national television, deeply shocking the nation ration. President Johnson took decisive action. He federalized the Alabama National Guard and then sent U.S. Army troops to Selma.
A clear case of federal intervention.
Absolutely. It was a textbook case of federal intervention explicitly to protect the constitutional rights of citizens when state authorities were actively, violently suppressing them. It was a clear demonstration of the Insurrection Act being used to uphold civil liberties against state resistance.
Okay, so that's one end of the spectrum. What about other examples?
Well, fast forward to the 1992 L.A. riots. A very different situation, sparked by the acquittal of 4 LAPD officers in the Rodney King beating. Los Angeles erupted. Thousands rioted, widespread smashing, looting, Molotov cocktails, just chaos.
And federal troops were deployed then too, right?
They were. But a closer analysis reveals a critical distinction from Selma. In the LA riots, some analyses argue that the predicate conditions did not justify the federal military response in quite the same way. What emerged, according to some critiques, was an overreaction and dangerous deployments of regular military, with potentially nearly disastrous consequences.
Dangerous how? What kind of consequences?
Well, imagine the situation reportedly documented. Marines, highly trained for combat, not policing, accompanying local police during a domestic dispute. An officer calls for cover, and the Marines reportedly sprayed the house with 200 M16 rounds.
Good grief. That's military force in a domestic dispute.
Exactly. It illustrates a profound challenge. Active duty military forces are trained for warfare, for overwhelming force, not necessarily for the nuanced de-escalation often required in domestic law enforcement. Their presence, their rules of engagement can escalate situations, leading to unintended and potentially tragic outcomes. It highlights the delicate balance and the specific dangers when military forces are used essentially as a domestic police force.
So Selma was about protecting rights from state action. LA was about restoring order amidst chaos, but maybe with an overreaction. Any other key examples?
Another major historical instance, often involving federal forces enforcing civil rights over state resistance, was the desegregation of schools throughout the South in the 1950s and 60s. Think Little Rock, Ole Miss.
Right, enforcing Brown v. Board of Education.
Exactly. These examples establish a pattern of federal intervention, often in response to state failures or active opposition to federal law, particularly concerning civil rights.
Okay, so how does the recent LA situation stack up against these historical precedents?
That's where the debate gets really heated. When we contrast these, clearer historical justifications with the June 2025 Los Angeles protests, legal analysts like Andrew Weissman openly question the necessity, the sheer scale of the deployment.
What was his specific point?
Weissman specifically asked why the National Guard was being activated in Los Angeles when protests have all but died out. His point suggests that the scale, and maybe even the timing of the deployment, might not align neatly with historical justifications for such a significant show of federal force.
Raising the question, was the deployment truly about restoring an order that was already returning, or was it perhaps sending a different kind of message, a political message?
That's certainly the implication some drew.
And that's where it gets really interesting, isn't it? Because the Trump administration has consistently held what's widely described as a maximalist view of presidential power.
Yes, a very expansive view.
They've argued, haven't they, that the decision to deploy federal troops domestically is solely within the executive power, the president's power. They even relied on an 1827 Supreme Court case, Martin v. Mott, to support this incredibly broad interpretation.
Which is a very old case, dealing with calling up the militia under different circumstances.
Right. But this isn't just a minor difference of opinion. It raises fundamental questions about the true extent of executive authority in domestic affairs. How far can a president go without needing direct congressional approval or maybe broader justification? It's an assertion that the president's judgment on this is virtually unchallengeable.
And this stance, this maximalist view, it immediately brings us to the core concept of the separation of powers, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The foundation of the whole system.
Our U.S. constitutional system fundamentally depends on these robust checks and balances between the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. The idea that one branch, particularly the executive, could act with such unbridled authority on domestic soil, fundamentally challenges the very foundations of this system.
It puts immense pressure on that delicate balance.
It does. The balance designed to prevent any single branch from becoming too powerful, to ensure accountability, and ultimately to protect individual liberties. When those lines blur, the system's integrity itself comes into question.
Has Congress played a role in enabling this expansion of executive power?
That's a really important angle. What's also been a significant historical trend, Contributing to the executive's expanded role is what we call congressional delegation.
Meaning Congress giving away its power.
In effect, yes. Over time, Congress has delegated broad swaths of its lawmaking powers. Powers the Constitution assigns primarily to them, to the executive branch. Agencies, departments, the president himself.
Why would they do that?
Complexity, efficiency arguments, sometimes political expediency. But then often, Congress has stood more or less idly by as presidents and administrators have wielded that power, sometimes even when it runs counter to what majorities in Congress might actually prefer. This voluntary or sometimes passive transfer of power has undoubtedly contributed to the executive's ability to assert such maximalist views. It blurs the lines of authority and makes the president's office far more powerful in practice than perhaps originally envisioned.
Have the courts weighed in on this balance recently? What have Supreme Court cases said about executive power?
Yes, let's look at some key cases that illuminate this complex, often shifting relationship. Trump v. United States from 2024 made a significant statement on presidential immunity.
Right, the immunity case.
It established that a former president is entitled to absolute immunity from criminal prosecution for actions falling within their, quote, conclusive and preclusive constitutional authority, the core executive powers, and presumptive immunity for all other official acts. That strengthens the presidency significantly.
What else?
Then there's Collins v. Yellen from 2021. That case held that the Constitution prohibits even modest restrictions on the president's power to remove the heads of certain independent agencies. Again, reinforcing the idea of a strong, independent executive controlling the administrative state.
So the trend seems to be towards strengthening the president's hand.
In many ways, yes. But it's not a complete blank check, and the courts have at times also established limits or acknowledged congressional roles.
Like what?
Well, Morrison v. Olson from 1988, the independent counsel case. That allowed Congress to place the power to appoint inferior executive officers outside the executive branch under certain conditions, suggesting a pathway for legislative checks on certain appointments.
Okay, so some limits.
And going even further back, Panama Refining Company v. Ryan in 1935, a landmark case from the New Deal era. It held that Congress cannot delegate legislative power without declaring a clear policy or standard to guide or limit the president. This implies that while Congress can delegate, it can't simply abdicate its responsibility to set boundaries. It needs to provide an intelligible principle.
So while presidents have gained power, the system still, at least in theory, contains checks against unlimited authority. But the tension is clearly still there.
Very much so. The tension remains, and the interpretation keeps evolving.
Given all this, are there calls for reform to maybe recalibrate that balance regarding domestic troop deployment?
Yes, absolutely. This all leads to a crucial discussion about proposed reforms designed specifically to rein in executive power in domestic military deployments. There's a strong argument being made that Congress, quote, should curb presidential authority by requiring congressional approval before the president invokes the Insurrection Act.
So Congress would have to sign off before troops are sent in under that act.
That's the idea. It would essentially reinsert the legislative branch into this crucial decision-making process, ensuring a more balanced approach and, arguably, upholding the original spirit of checks and balances that our system depends on.
What would be the practical effect?
Well, think about the implications. It would mean a president couldn't unilaterally declare a situation an insurrection or a major obstruction and send in federal troops without at least some legislative buy-in. It would foster greater accountability, require more justification up front.
It sounds like Congress reclaiming some power it might have ceded over time.
Exactly. Ensuring that such a weighty decision, deploying military forces against fellow citizens, is truly a shared responsibility of the government, reflecting broader consensus, not just the determination of one branch or potentially one person.
Okay, we've covered the events, the legal framework, the historical context. Let's shift focus a bit to the broader political climate. How does America's unique political division play into all this?
Polarization. To fully grasp the context of events like those in Los Angeles, we really need to step back and look at the unique nature of American political division. It's often said that America is exceptional in the nature of its political divide.
Exceptional how? More divided than other places.
It's not just the depth, though it runs particularly deep here. It's that it's especially multifaceted. It's not simply about disagreeing on policy, like taxes or healthcare. It's about this layering of differences that makes finding common ground incredibly difficult.
What kind of layers are we talking about?
This brings us to the concept of stacked identities. What researchers mean by this is that the divisions between our two major parties, Republicans and Democrats, have intensified over time as various types of identities have become stacked on top of people's partisan identities.
So my party affiliation aligns with my other identities more now.
Increasingly so. It means that your political affiliation is much more likely today to align not just with your policy preferences, but also with your race, your religion, and your core ideology. For example, if you identify as a Republican, you're now far more likely to share a similar racial, religious, and ideological background with fellow Republicans than you might have been, say, 50 years ago. And the same is true for Democrats. The parties become much more homogenous internally, but much more different from each other.
Creating these incredibly cohesive but also incredibly opposed blocs.
Precisely. And when your political opponents are not just people who hold different ideas about government, but are also perceived as fundamentally other in terms of their cultural background, their religious beliefs, maybe their race, finding common cause becomes extraordinarily difficult.
It changes the nature of disagreement.
It really does. Some analysts argue it's hard to find another example of polarization in the world that fuses all three major types of identity divisions, race, religion, ideology, in a similar way. This leads to what some describe as a singular axis of conflict, where we find no toehold for common cause or collective national identity. Imagine trying to find common ground with someone when you feel like they don't just disagree with you, they inhabit a completely different cultural universe. It's that profound. This goes beyond typical political rivalries. It's arguably a deep societal chasm.
That sounds incredibly bleak. Has it always been this bad? Or is it stacking unique to our current moment?
That's where we need to add some historical nuance, because it's crucial we don't romanticize the past as some golden age of unity. It really wasn't.
How so?
Well, eras of relatively muted partisan conflict, think perhaps the late 1950s, were also often characterized by structural injustice that kept many voices, particularly those of non-white Americans, out of the political arena.
So less visible conflict might have meant more suppression.
Exactly. Less visible conflict didn't necessarily mean a more just or inclusive society. It often meant that certain grievances were simply suppressed or unheard. And similarly, previous eras of deep divisions, such as the late 1960s, were far less partisan, but hardly less violent or destabilizing.
Right. The Civil Rights Movement, Vietnam protests, urban riots, intense divisions, just maybe not aligned along party lines in the same way.
Precisely. Intense divisions were certainly present, just perhaps not along such rigidly defined and identity-aligned partisan lines as we see today. This crude pace reminds us that while the form of polarization changes, division and unrest are certainly not new to America.
That historical distinction is so critical because it helps us understand maybe some of the disparities we've seen in how different types of protests are treated today. Is there evidence of that?
There is. Looking at data from a particularly intense period, May to November 2020, which included widespread protests on various issues, authorities were reportedly more than twice as likely to attempt to break up and disperse a left-wing protest than a right-wing one.
Twice as likely? That's a significant difference.
It is. And when law enforcement did intervene in those situations, force was used more often against left-wing protests, about 51% of the time, compared to right-wing protests, where force was used in only about 34% of interventions.
That clearly highlights an asymmetric treatment, doesn't it? It suggests responses aren't always purely based on the immediate level of threat or violence.
And that asymmetric treatment isn't simply explained away by the level of violence from protesters, which is often the immediate assumption. Consider this statistic. Analysis showed that over 90% of protests associated with the Black Lives Matter movement remained peaceful.
The vast majority were peaceful.
Yes. Yet, even when focusing solely on these peaceful demonstrations, law enforcement still engaged in peaceful BLM-related demonstrations over twice as often, 5% of the time compared to 2% of the time, for other types of peaceful protests.
Wow. So even peaceful BLM protests faced intervention more often than other peaceful protests?
That's what the data suggests. It strongly indicates that law enforcement responses are not simply dictated by situational threats, but are rather guided by strategic considerations. There seems to be a deliberate choice, perhaps based on political calculations or ideological alignments, in how different demonstrations are approached, often leading to this disproportionate response against certain groups or causes.
And part of those strategic considerations involves language, right? How protests are characterized.
Absolutely. The framing is crucial. We saw this vividly with the Trump administration's attempts to characterize the Black Lives Matter protests as an insurrection.
Calling protest an insurrection, that's incredibly loaded language.
Extremely. It's a powerful, politically charged use of language, aiming to delegitimize the entire movement by equating peaceful protest and even instances of rioting with a direct existential threat to the state. But it apparently faced internal pushback.
From within the administration or military?
The military leaders, reportedly, like the then chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley. He reportedly resisted this framing internally, stating something to the effect of, Mr. President, that guy referring to historical examples had an insurrection. You don't have an insurrection. When guys show up in gray and start bombing Fort Sumter, you'll have an insurrection.
Drawing a very clear line between protest, even riot, and actual armed rebellion.
Exactly. It reveals this strategic struggle over how to define the legitimacy of protests and what constitutes a true existential threat to the state versus legitimate, constitutionally protected civic action. The language used here isn't just descriptive. It's a political weapon used to shape perception and justify responses.
What's the broader impact, then, when you have these broad military or heavy-handed law enforcement responses, particularly to racial justice protests?
The broader impact is profound and, frankly, quite chilling for democratic norms. It burdens the exercise of citizenship by erecting barriers to collective political action. When the military is deployed to quell protests, or when disproportionate force is used consistently against certain groups, it fundamentally suppresses the very act of protesting. It does this by escalating violence and creating an intimidating, even dangerous atmosphere for people considering exercising their rights.
It sends a message.
A very clear, chilling message. It effectively communicated consequently which causes were threatening and which were legitimate exercises of citizenship. In essence, it defines the boundaries of acceptable dissent, often along racial and ideological lines. It makes it clear which voices are deemed acceptable and will be tolerated, and which are deemed threatening and will be silenced, potentially through force.
So for you, the citizen, this means the perceived legitimacy of your right to protest might become contingent not on the Constitution, but on the political leanings of the powers that be.
That's the danger, that the protection of free speech and assembly becomes conditional rather than fundamental. It's a critical tension right at the heart of our democracy.
How does this intense polarization and these differing responses affect actual governance? Does it make it harder to solve problems?
Absolutely. What's even more concerning when we think about the implications for governance in this highly polarized environment is how it feeds into potential future scenarios. One concept analysts talk about is delegated democracy.
Delegated democracy, what's that?
It suggests that Congress continues to transfer powers to the executive branch, not necessarily by some grand design, but almost by default, out of its own struggles to develop legislative solutions to complex national problems.
Because Congress is too gridlocked to act.
Precisely. When Congress is perpetually gridlocked, unable to pass comprehensive legislation or find bipartisan consensus on major issues, a power vacuum is created. And in this vacuum, presidents often step in. They act, sometimes portraying it as needing to lead the nation as a whole, potentially even avoiding hyperpartisan actions in the short term.
Why avoid partisanship if they have the power?
Perhaps not out of magnanimity, but maybe to preserve their power and flexibility for future use, to not overplay their hand immediately. It's a symptom of a legislative body that's become unable to effectively legislate, leaving the executive branch to fill the void, often through executive orders, regulations, or broad interpretations of existing laws.
So for you, the listener, this means more critical decisions might be made by the president and their administration rather than by your elected representatives in Congress. A fundamental shift in the balance of power.
That's the core concern.
And that struggle within Congress, that gridlock, it feels very real right now.
It is. The current political environment has fostered what's described as chronically insecure, narrow, and fluctuating congressional majorities.
Meaning control flips back and forth constantly.
Exactly. Neither political party can maintain a stable, strong majority for very long. The margins in the House and Senate are often razor thin, and control flips back and forth almost every election cycle. This leads to this vicious cycle where each party regularly goes too far in its efforts to unilaterally advance its agenda and embarrass the other side, only to be punished by voters and pushed out of power in the next election.
It becomes a never-ending shouting match.
Pretty much. Where the two sides are so focused on scoring political points and undermining each other that they essentially cancel each other out when it comes to developing actual durable solutions to the nation's pressing problems. This perpetual gridlock naturally makes Congress less effective, less capable of addressing national challenges. And critically, it creates that environment where the executive branch is increasingly empowered or perhaps feels compelled to step in and act, as we just discussed. It's deeply frustrating for anyone hoping for functional, comprehensive national policy.
So you have this gridlock, you have intense polarization, and then you have these highly visible instances of domestic unrest. How do those protests then impact political outcomes?
Well, that gridlock, coupled with these highly visible events, leads directly to how protests can impact political outcomes. It's generally true, as a political science axiom, that protest of any kind sours opinion for any incumbent government.
Really, any protest hurts the incumbent.
Generally speaking, yes. When there's widespread unrest, regardless of the underlying cause or who is protesting, it creates a perception of instability, a sense that things are out of control, a failure to maintain order. And history consistently shows that widespread political unrest is rarely to the benefit of the incumbent. Voters punish governments that seem unable to keep the peace. They often do. This provides crucial context for how political parties react to and try to leverage such events. If you're the incumbent party, sustained unrest is a major political liability, full stop. So the stakes for controlling the narrative around protests are incredibly high for both sides.
One side trying to legitimize it as dissent, the other framing it as chaos.
Exactly. One side tries to paint the unrest as legitimate dissent, perhaps a righteous cry for justice, while the other tries to cast it as dangerous lawlessness and chaos threatening ordinary people. Both are desperately trying to win the hearts and minds of those normie voters we talked about, the ones who are just trying to understand what's happening and why their lives or communities are being disrupted.
Okay, let's pivot now to that global lens again. How does all this internal turmoil, the protests, the polarization, the debates about power, look from the outside?
Looking through a global lens, it becomes strikingly clear that U.S. domestic issues have a truly global reach. We saw this vividly, as we mentioned, with the Black Lives Matter demonstrations. They weren't confined to American cities. They sparked a global phenomenon.
The solidarity protests.
Right. Solidarity protests held from Berlin's Alexanderplatz to under the Eiffel Tower in Paris, outside the British Houses of Parliament in London, and even a powerful memorial service held in Ghana. This just underscores that U.S. internal struggles are not merely domestic concerns anymore. They are observed, discussed, dissected, and reacted to worldwide, actively shaping international perceptions of the United States. Our internal health is, in many ways, our external advertisement to the world.
And that perception matters for leadership, presumably.
Absolutely. This direct link between domestic stability, social cohesion, and international leadership is paramount. The U.S.'s credibility as an international leader really depends on our ability to demonstrate the effectiveness of our governance at home, and to show that we are continually striving for that more perfect union the founders envisioned.
So practice what you preach.
Essentially.
Yeah.
This requires us, as a nation, to tear down that mental Berlin Wall between domestic and foreign policy. We need to acknowledge that internal cohesion, social justice, effective and fair governance, these aren't just domestic nice-to-haves. They're fundamental prerequisites for external influence and maintaining moral authority on the global stage.
Is there historical precedent for the U.S. understanding this link?
Yes, definitely. During the Cold War, the U.S. understood this acutely, perhaps even better than today sometimes. It took race discrimination seriously as something that harmed U.S. foreign relations.
Because the Soviets used it as propaganda.
Precisely. The Soviets consistently highlighted American segregation and racial violence to undermine U.S. claims of leading the free world. U.S. policymakers believed that to effectively lead the world as a beacon of democracy, America had to be a leader on racial equality at home. The hypocrisy of promoting freedom abroad while denying basic rights to its own citizens at home was a significant vulnerability. Today, in our hyper-connected, instantly visible world, that link between domestic reality and international standing is arguably even more immediate and profound.
And we continue to see examples where U.S. internal debates look odd, maybe, to the rest of the world.
Yes, we see this play out in various ways that highlight what's sometimes been called American exceptionalism of the worst kind. Think about the political debate and a partisan debate, but the wearing of masks as a safety measure during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Right, that became incredibly politicized here.
In stark contrast to virtually all other developed countries, where public health measures, while maybe debated, were largely adopted cohesively based on scientific advice. In the U.S., mask wearing became this deeply politicized issue, a symbol of partisan identity almost. To the rest of the world, this looked frankly bizarre, like an inability to act cohesively on even a basic public health measure. It showcased our internal divisions and, to some, a breakdown in collective action or trust in expertise.
And that impacts perceived competence.
Directly. It impacts how the U.S. was perceived in terms of its ability to lead or even manage its own affairs effectively, let alone advise other nations. It presented a picture of a nation so divided it couldn't agree on fundamental facts or basic communal responsibility during a crisis.
Are there other internal factors that impact U.S. foreign policy effectiveness?
Another incredibly important point, often overlooked in these discussions, is the necessity of diversity within our diplomatic corps and foreign policy institutions. There's a real, documented need for a diplomatic corps that looks and feels like America.
Why is that so important for foreign policy?
Well, it isn't just about optics or meeting diversity quotas, though representation matters. People from different social identities bring different stakes, and crucially, different experiences to the table. For example, a person of color working within the U.S. system might have lived experiences of discrimination or systemic challenges that a white colleague, even in a similar professional setting, simply wouldn't have.
And those experiences are relevant to diplomacy.
Immensely relevant. These lived experiences are crucial because they directly impact the U.S.'s ability to engage effectively and authentically on the world stage, especially when discussing complex issues like human rights, democratic values, systemic inequality, or even economic development in diverse global contexts. Diplomacy is fundamentally about connection and understanding, and that requires understanding genuinely different perspectives rooted in different experiences.
But is the system attracting and keeping that diverse talent?
That's the challenge. This ties into the very real problem of retention within foreign policy institutions like the State Department. The question becomes, as one commentator put it, how can we build an anti-racist organizational culture within the State Department so people like me, as a woman of color, actually want to stay?
So it's not just recruitment, but the internal culture.
Exactly. This reflects a deeper systemic issue within U.S. foreign policy institutions that impacts their effectiveness and their ability to genuinely represent the diverse nation they serve. If the U.S. can't attract and retain diverse talent in its diplomatic ranks, it weakens its overall diplomatic capabilities. It weakens its ability to connect authentically with a diverse global community. And it fundamentally undermines its own message of diversity and inclusion when projected abroad.
These internal dynamics, the polarization, the questions about leadership style, they can manifest quite dramatically on the global stage, can't they? We saw a recent example of that.
You're thinking of the Oval Office meeting.
Yes. Consider the extraordinary shouting match that was widely reported between President Trump and President Zelensky of Ukraine in the Oval Office. This was apparently far from a typical, polite diplomatic encounter.
What were the reports saying?
Reports describe President Trump accusing the Ukrainian leader of gambling with World War I, a very strange historical reference, and of not being grateful for the support of the U.S. This was happening while Ukraine was, fighting for its survival against a major invasion, heavily reliant on that U.S. support.
A public and heated display of tension between two leaders whose nations were supposed to be critical allies in a major international conflict. That's highly unusual.
Extremely. And the dramatic details of that clash are quite revealing about the power dynamics and perhaps the clashing personalities at play. Zelensky reportedly set an aggressive tone himself from the start, notably refusing to wear a suit, declaring something like, "I will wear costume," meaning his usual military-style attire after this war will finish.
A visual defiance of traditional White House formality. A statement in itself.
It seems so, and the confrontation apparently escalated over the prospects for a peace deal, with President Trump asserting that if you didn't have our military equipment, this war would have been over in 2 weeks.
Wow. That's not only minimizing Ukraine's own immense efforts and sacrifices, but also implicitly suggesting Ukraine's very survival depended entirely on U.S. aid and therefore perhaps on U.S. terms, a clear assertion of dominance.
What were the immediate consequences of this clash?
Well, the immediate consequences were significant and quite tangible. Firstly, a much-anticipated minerals deal, one that would have allowed American access to critical mineral mining in Ukraine, was not signed. That's a potentially crucial economic and strategic opportunity lost, at least for the time being.
And personally for Zelensky.
Furthermore, Zelensky was reportedly ordered to leave the White House. That's a highly unusual and very public rebuke, signaling deep displeasure from the president. And then President Trump apparently took to social media almost immediately, posting that Zelensky was not ready for peace.
Broadcasting the fractured relationship to the entire world.
Exactly. This entire incident wasn't just a breakdown in private communication. It was a very public display of fractured relations between two supposedly critical allies witnessed by the world and directly impacting real-world agreements and potentially strategic calculations.
What was the ripple effect? How did allies and maybe adversaries react to seeing this play out?
The ripple effect was immediate and incredibly illustrative of deeper geopolitical trends and alignments. On one hand, you saw European leaders quickly rallying behind Ukraine, perhaps sensing a potential shift or instability in U.S. support.
Who specifically?
British Prime Minister Starmer, French President Macron, Polish Prime Minister Tusk, Canadian Prime Minister Trudeau, key NATO and G7 allies all publicly rallied behind Ukraine. They expressed full backing and emphasized continued support for Ukraine's sovereignty and the goal of a lasting, just peace.
Showing a united front, perhaps even in contrast to the U.S. position at that moment.
It certainly looked that way, a move to solidify their own alliances and send a message of resolve, both to Kiev and perhaps to Moscow, regardless of the signals coming from Washington.
And on the other hand, did anyone support Trump's handling of it?
Oh, yes. There was clear and immediate support for Trump's stance from certain quarters. Hungary's Prime Minister, Viktor Orban, who is often aligned with Trump's more nationalist, transactional approach to international relations, publicly praised Mr. Trump.
Okay, Orban. Anyone else?
Simultaneously, and perhaps more predictably, former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev reportedly applauded Mr. Trump, calling President Zelensky an insolent pig who got a proper slapdown.
Charming. That highlights how the incident was perceived by those who might directly benefit from a weakening of Western alliances or a more isolationist U.S. foreign policy.
Exactly. It was a moment seized upon by adversaries, or those skeptical of the current international order, to celebrate perceived disunity and friction within the Western bloc.
If we connect this specific event back to the broader picture of U.S. foreign policy, what does it tell us?
I think it starkly illustrates a potential trend towards isolationism, or at least a more conditional, transactional approach to foreign policy, within segments of the U.S. public and political leadership. And polling data reinforces this underlying sentiment.
What does the polling show?
Recent polling shows that fewer than 6 in 10 Americans believe the United States should play an active part in world affairs. Unquote. That figure is actually one of the lowest levels recorded since the Chicago Council on Global Affairs first started asking that question way back in 1974.
A significant decline in belief in active global engagement.
It is, and this growing sentiment, coupled with high-profile incidents like the Oval Office clash, makes potential U.S. actions things that might have seemed unthinkable just a decade ago, like withdrawal from the North Atlantic Treaty Organization or an abandonment of Ukraine in the face of Russian aggression, now seem far more plausible, or at least debatable, within the mainstream political discourse.
So that Oval Office clash wasn't just an isolated diplomatic blow-up.
Not at all. It was arguably both a symptom of these deeper shifts and a powerful signal to the world of potentially profound changes in America's role on the global stage. Changes driven by both internal political dynamics and this evolving public sentiment. It really asks the world, especially allies, to consider how reliable is America as a partner in the long term.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. We've navigated this really complex web, haven't we? Connecting the domestic unrest in Los Angeles, the intricate legal history of military intervention, the deep currents of political division here in the U.S., and seeing their stark reflections on the global stage.
Yeah. It's all interconnected.
What stands out, perhaps above all else, is just how inextricably linked America's internal stability or instability is to its international perception and its global influence. From the sharp criticism coming out of Chinese state media to the immediate, almost instinctive public reactions of European leaders, the world is keenly observing how the U.S. manages its challenges, both the internal ones and the external ones.
Indeed. And the very debates we've discussed over presidential authority, the framing of protests, the public clashes with international leaders, they speak volumes, don't they, about the state of American democracy itself. And as that recent Oval Office confrontation so dramatically underscored, these domestic dynamics can directly impact crucial international relationships, strategic alliances, and maybe even the very fate of nations caught in global conflicts.
It's a powerful reminder, isn't it, that a nation's strength isn't just measured by its military hardware or its GDP figure.
Not at all. It's fundamentally measured by its internal cohesion, its perceived fairness, its ability to function effectively, and its perceived commitment to upholding its own stated values, both at home and abroad.
So as you, our listener, reflect on this deep dive today, maybe consider this. In an era where information travels instantly across borders, where domestic challenges become global spectacles almost in real time, what does it truly mean for a nation to project strength and stability on the world stage?
How do those internal fractures, the deep divisions we've talked about, influence a country's ability to lead, to form lasting alliances, and simply to be seen as a reliable partner?
And maybe what responsibility do citizens have, not just in shaping their own nation's domestic reality through voting and participation, but also in influencing, perhaps indirectly, its international image and its very role in the complex global order?